The red dirt road carried Cole, wandering 3 years, back to the abandoned Harrington Ranch. But behind the creaking wooden door, he stumbled upon Eliza, a stranger curled on a torn sofa, like a shadow waiting to be saved. One man returning from exile, one woman fleeing the shame of town gossip. Both carried wounds no one cared to understand. In that damp, dim room their eyes met, their breaths crossed, and loneliness turned into recognition. Cole stepped closer. Eliza shrank back, her face flushed in the flicker of firelight. No vow was spoken, yet a single glance was enough to make the silent house sigh, as though it bore witness to two souls beginning to move in rhythm as one. The road leading back to the Harrington Ranch lay thick with dust, like a strip of faded memory. Wagon wheels ground against the dry earth, raising a harsh, scraping sound. Cole sat upright, his eyes fixed on the distant ridgeline, faintly purple in the late light. It had been 3 long years since he last set foot here. 3 years drifting across the land, taking whatever work came his way, cutting timber, driving cattle, digging irrigation ditches. He had not left in search of fortune, only because he could not stand the hollow silence of his uncle's old house, once filled with laughter and the smell of morning coffee, then left barren after death claimed the only kin he had. The ranch came into view, stirring both ache and estrangement. Tall weeds swallowed the path where once children's boots had left prints. The stable sagged, half collapsed. The porch leaned like an old arm bracing against the wind. The once blue shutters had weathered to bare, gray wood. Cole lingered on horseback, breathing in the scent of dust and dry grass, as though touching the raw edge of memory. His chest felt heavy, yet his gaze steadied. Whatever else, this was still family land, still a piece of ground to return to. He tied his horse to the old post and stepped onto the rotting porch. Each board groaned under his boots, a reminder that time spared nothing, not the place, not him. His calloused hand rested on the door, feeling its cracked grain, the cold seeping through. He had sworn once never to come back, yet wandering without anchor had led him full circle. The door swung open with a rusty shriek. Damp air rushed out, carrying the scent of wet wood and old ashes. Cole stepped inside, expecting dust-coated chairs, empty rooms. Instead, he froze. On the worn sofa in the front room lay a figure, a slight shape, curled in on itself like a wintering bird, wrapped in a threadbare blanket. The rise and fall of her breath came unsteady. For a moment he thought his eyes deceived him, that it was nothing but bundled cloth. Then the blanket shifted, and a face appeared, pale, framed by loose hair spilling across the cushion, brows knotted as if still trapped in a dream. Cole's heart hammered. He had expected no one in this house, least of all a young woman. Her presence here, in the wreck of what once was, felt unreal. He cleared his throat, boots scraping across the floorboards. Her eyes flew open, startling blue, wide with fear, like a cornered fawn. She jolted upright, the blanket slipping away, revealing a thin frame in a worn cotton dress. Fingers clutched the arm of the sofa, trembling as though to hold herself steady. By instinct, Cole drew back half a step. In that instant, he saw himself years ago, the same rootless, hunted feeling, folding in on oneself against judgment. His gaze softened, though his voice stayed rough as gravel. "Who are you?" The question cut the air, but no answer came. She only stared at him, her eyes darting over his sunburned face, the dust-caked coat, the heavy boots. It was plain his arrival unsettled her as much as hers unsettled him. The room thickened with silence, broken only by the wind keening through the cracks and the pounding of two hearts. Cole exhaled, curling his hand into a fist, then letting it ease open. He had no wish to scare her, nor to quarrel, yet truth was plain. This was his house, and she had no rightful claim here. Still, instead of forcing her out, he stood still, meeting her fearful gaze. For a breath of time, two lost lives crossed paths. A man wandering home to the past. A woman, left with nowhere else to go, clinging to the ruins of a roof. The pause stretched, as though the old house itself held its breath. Outside, the sun dipped behind the ridge, shadows pressing close. In the dust-choked room, two strangers faced each other, carrying wounds that had no easy name. Cole lowered his head slightly, saying nothing more. He dragged a wooden chair aside, keeping space between them, and dropped his worn pack onto the floor. Dust rose around it, drifting in the dim light. The small act was its own admission. He would not drive her out. Not tonight. By some strange turn, his silence gave her ease. Her shoulders slackened. Her trembling slowed, as if permission had been granted to breathe. A gust rattled the windows, the house groaning like a body in pain. Yet beneath that weary sound, something faint took root. Fragile, unnamed, but strong enough to pull both of them back from the edge of loneliness. The first night Cole returned to the ranch, he was no longer alone. The silence stretched so long it seemed even dust could be heard falling. The young woman before Cole hesitated, her hand tightening around the frayed edge of her dress. At last, from her dry lips came a whisper. Eliza. Eliza Monroe. The sound was small, trembling, yet carried a strange pride. As if standing in a house that was not hers, beneath the scrutiny of his gaze, she still had one thing no one could take. The name, the last fragment of herself. Cole gave a slight nod. He pressed no further. He did not need to know where she came from, or how she had found her way here. He recognized the look in her face, the same he once bore himself, driven out, left wandering, with no safe place to lie down. He dropped his heavy bag onto the nail-loose table, dust rising in a cloud. No words of accusation, no sharp questions, only a glance, half wary, half understanding, before he turned into the kitchen to hunt for the stale water left in the old jar. That night, they spoke no more. The oil lamp flickered, throwing Eliza's hunched figure into trembling light, while Cole's tall frame stretched a blanket on the floor. The wind slid through the cracks, its moan like a low hymn for two strangers now sharing one roof. By morning, faint sunlight spilled through the dusty panes. Eliza woke to see Cole crouched beneath the eaves, hammer in hand, his broad shoulders shifting with each strike. The smell of dry wood and iron mingled with damp earth. She lingered before finally stepping barefoot onto the cold boards of the porch. Cole did not look her way, but his voice came rough and low. This is my family's land. I came back to mend it. Eliza bit her lip, silent. She knew she had no rightful claim to stay, but when he turned, his eyes caught hers, full of tension. To salvage a shred of dignity, she let out a tight breath and added, her voice unsteady yet clear. "I was a school teacher, in Hullbrook." Cole did not answer, only inclined his head as if to say he heard. Eliza looked out toward the empty field, needing the open space to carry her words. Memories spilled heavy as stones. She spoke of the classroom, of children sounding out letters from a chipped chalkboard, of her voice steady with pride. That pride shattered when a wealthy townsman, the father of a pupil, began circling close. At first with sly remarks, then with deliberate touches. Eliza resisted, stood firm. But one evening, with only the two of them left in the room, he seized her wrist, pulling her against him. Her slap was her last defense. By morning, the story was turned. Whispers spread that the poor schoolmistress had thrown herself at him. His wife stoked the fire. Gossip raced through Hullbrook. The school did not shield her. They dismissed her as though wiping away a blot of ink. Her voice faltered there. Her hands clasped tight, her face pale, shame burning in her eyes for a sin that was never hers. Cole braced himself against the doorframe, staring toward the mow, ridges. He listened without interruption. In his silence, she found not suspicion but a strange kinship. For Cole, too, knew that wound. After his uncle's death, tongues in town wagged that he had neglected him, even whispered darker lies, that he had turned his back to claim the land. Rumors once planted, no one bothered to pull, so he left, carrying only wordless bitterness. In that dusty kitchen, without saying it, both understood. They were more alike than they had guessed. Eliza bowed her head, her voice no more than a breath. "I have nowhere else to go. If you wish, I'll leave today." Cole looked at her. His eyes, usually cold as mountain wind, softened for a moment. He did not answer in words. He only turned, rummaged in a wooden chest, and placed a few withered potatoes on the table. He pushed them gently toward her. A quiet message. "Eat. Stay." Eliza lifted her gaze, eyes brimming. She understood. He would not ask her to defend herself, nor cast her out again. He would let her remain. By dusk, Cole tended the fire while Eliza washed the pots. Small motions, yet they seeded warmth in the old house. For the first time in years, Cole heard not just the wail of wind, but the sound of spoons clinking, fabric rustling. He leaned back on the bench, watching her bent over the basin. She seemed so slight, as if she might vanish into the space around her, yet every gesture carried a stubborn endurance. Cole drew a long breath, his chest easing a little. He knew this much. Life would not be silent anymore. That figure, though she had spoken only shards of sorrow, was already pressing her shape into the story of this home. And her name, Eliza Monroe, simple, fragile, now struck his ear like the first note of something new. On the first morning since Eliza stayed, the old house was no longer entirely silent. A rooster's crow carried from the valley, and pale sunlight slipped through dust-coated windows, casting long, slanted beams across the wooden floor. Cole stirred awake to the sound of dry wood being gathered, the faint crackle of kindling catching flame. A trace of smoke drifted in, stirring memories of his boyhood, when Uncle Silas would be up before dawn coaxing fire from embers. He rose, body still heavy from the long road back. Out on the porch, Eliza bent low to gather twigs, stacking them neat, as though each piece were precious. Her faded brown dress brushed with dust, but her movements were careful, deliberate. Cole stood in the doorway, watching in silence. It had been years since he'd seen a woman move about this house, filling spaces he had resigned to emptiness. As he turned to his work, the silence between them lost the weight of the night before. Cole took up his hammer and began repairing the warped boards of the porch roof. Each strike rang out sharp, as if shaking the house awake after its long slumber. Eliza, after tending the fire, sat near the window with needle and thread, mending the frayed curtain edge with patient stitches. Side by side, without speaking, they set about piecing things together. He with wood and nails, she with cloth and thread. Small acts, but together they wove a rhythm of life. By midday, Eliza laid out a simple meal, a pot of stewed potatoes, a few slices of cornbread left in the box, a jug of warm water. She placed the bowls nervously, as if fearing to do it wrong. Cole sat down, staring at the humble spread, and something in his chest tightened. How long had it been since he'd known a proper meal? His years on the drift had been hard bread, salted meat, whatever he could buy quick from a tavern. Now before him was food with the scent of firewood, food shaped by someone's hands. He dipped his spoon, tasting the tender potato. Its plain sweetness filled his mouth, and he let out a long, unguarded breath. Eliza glanced up, startled by his eyes on her. Yet in hers flickered a faint spark of gladness. "It's good," he muttered, his voice low but sincere. A simple praise, yet it carried weight. Eliza's cheeks flushed as she bent her head with a small smile. They ate quietly, no stories, no laughter. Still, for Cole, it was enough to stir something he had long forgotten. The feeling of sitting beneath a roof, sharing hot food with another soul. In the afternoon, Cole returned to heavier work, setting fence posts, hauling rotted wood from the stable. Sweat streamed down his temples, soaking his back. Eliza could not match his labor, but she found ways to lend her hands, shaking out the dusty blankets, scrubbing the kitchen shelf, putting the hearth in order. Each time he passed, Cole caught glimpses of her slight form bent over, tired yet steady. He said nothing, but a strange awareness grew. The house, once a burden he carried, was beginning to feel like ground shared. Toward evening, the sun turned the fields gold. Cole dropped onto the porch steps, legs stretched, lungs full of earth and wood smoke. Eliza brought him a cup of water, set it down without a word. He nodded his thanks. In that simple moment, no grand gesture, no heavy words, something unnamed stirred. Perhaps this was what he had sought without knowing, the shape of a home. Night settled, crickets humming outside. The lamp glowed warm against the walls. Eliza sat with a worn book, lips moving over the lines, while Cole cleaned his rusted rifle with slow care. The quiet no longer felt empty. Even silence itself had become a language. Cole lifted his eyes, watching Eliza in the lamplight. Her lashes cast shadows, her face calm in its stillness. He realized he was growing accustomed to this sight. Her slight frame steady in its quiet labor, her presence breathing life into rooms once hollow. When she closed the book and snuffed the lamp, Cole felt a shift inside. He had believed his days would end in solitude. No ties, no bonds. Yet through the smallest of tasks, the plainest of meals, her presence had already altered how he looked upon these walls. The fire in the hearth glowed steady, casting their two shadows together. An old house was waking, and in Cole's heart, something too had just begun. Nights in the mountains were always long and steeped in cold. When darkness fell, The wind howled through the cracks. The porch groaned beneath its own weight, and the house seemed to whisper with an old, tired voice. In that shifting gloom, the fire in the hearth stood as the house's single beating heart, glowing red, burning steady against the chill. Eliza often sat at the small table, a worn book resting in her hands. At times she read aloud, but mostly her eyes only skimmed the words, as though seeking a place of refuge in her mind. Each time she looked up, she would sometimes catch Cole's gaze across the room. He spoke little, revealing less, yet there was something in his eyes, an intent watchfulness, as though he searched for a truth he had no name for. On some nights there was nothing but the sound of wind and paper rustling. Cole sat close to the fire, feeding it with practiced ease, his movements slow and measured. He never noticed how her eyes followed him, but each time the flames leapt brighter, Eliza felt warmth that was more than heat. It was the quiet proof of his care. When Cole dozed in his chair, head tilted, lines softening in sleep, Eliza would step closer. She would draw a blanket over his shoulders, her hand brushing the sun-darkened skin of his arm, catching the steady warmth there. Something in those moments made her linger, listening to the rush of her own heartbeat. One night, when the fire was low, she sat beside him. His face in sleep seemed less severe. The furrows around his eyes softened into weariness rather than hardness. Slowly, her hand lifted, a finger tracing the line of his lashes, down the bridge of his nose, pausing at his lips, half-parted. She seemed to test the outline of a secret locked away for years. But at her touch, his eyes opened. Eliza froze, breath caught. His gray gaze, no longer clouded with dreams, shone sharp and startling, yet without anger. He caught her hand, his rough palm holding her slender, trembling fingers. The weight of that touch robbed her of air. With a faint tug, he drew her closer, and she felt the heat of him against her cheek. The moment grew taut, so taut she longed to flee. And she did. Snatching back her hand, color burning her face, she stood, skirts rustling, and retreated to her narrow bed. Cole remained where he was, silent, watching her turn away. At his mouth flickered the ghost of a smile. He said nothing, but something had shifted. In the nights that followed, they no longer held each other's eyes so long, yet the silence between them was lighter. It was like a fragile thread strung across the space, binding two hearts that had known only solitude. No vows, no speeches, only the placing of wood on the fire, a blanket pulled higher, a hand held for a fleeting instant. These were enough to tell them they were no longer alone. Eliza lay in her narrow bed, staring up at the beams. The wind still shrieked outside, but her fear was gentler now. She replayed the look in his eyes, the sudden clasp of his hand. It left her flustered, yet warmed her through. It had been so long since she believed anyone might truly see her, let alone hold her trembling hand as Cole had. Cole, left by the fire after her small figure turned away, sat still a long while. He rarely let his thoughts show, but his chest carried a pressure he could not name. He had lived years with fleeting faces, meetings that vanished like smoke. Eliza, by accident more than intent, had cracked something in him, some seam in the hard shell he carried. That night, the Harrington house was quieter than ever. But between two lives once so far apart, a thread had been spun, fragile, quiet, yet strong enough to endure, though neither dared call it by its name. A sudden rainstorm swept down the mountains one gray afternoon. Wind shrieked through the cracks. The scent of damp earth pressed into the old cabin. Cole was mending the fence line when he heard Eliza's cough carry from the kitchen. At first, he thought it nothing more than a chill from the damp air. But when he stepped inside, he saw her slumped over the table, hair plastered wet against her cheek, shoulders trembling, her face drained of color. Cole rushed forward. Her skin burned hot as flame. He lifted her carefully, laying her on the narrow bed in the corner. Eliza drifted in and out, lips dry, whispering broken words as if speaking to ghosts. Don't send me away. I'll be good." Cole sat beside her, brows drawn tight. Each word cut deep. He clasped her frail hand, finding it fever-hot yet fragile, as if it might dissolve. His rough palm, accustomed to rains and hammers, trembled as he wiped the sweat from her brow. Rain hammered the roof, but its fury was softer than her faint sobs. Lost in a fever dream, she seemed trapped in childhood terrors, pleading with absent parents not to abandon her. Cole gathered her close, his arm steady around her narrow shoulders. He had no remedy but to hold her, murmuring words he had never spoken to another. "You're safe. I'm here. No one's leaving you." He stayed through the night, listening to rain and her ragged breaths. Again and again, he laid cool cloths to her forehead, lifted a spoon of water to her lips. He had never cared for anyone this way. His life had been labor and solitary miles. But now, with this woman adrift in fever, he felt bound to be her anchor, believing somehow his presence alone might keep her in this world. By dawn, the storm eased. Only drops fell from the eaves, steady and slow. Eliza still lay weak, but the fever broke. Her lashes stirred, and at last her eyes opened, pale and uncertain. She glanced about, bewildered, until she saw Cole seated close, his gaze steady and patient. Her cheeks flushed, shame flickering at the thought of what she had spoken in delirium. I must have said nonsense, didn't I?" she rasped, trying to rise. Cole pressed a hand to her shoulder, firm but gentle. "Rest." She bit her lip, eyes turning away. In her fever she had bared wounds she had always hidden beneath pride, and the thought made her flush hotter than the sickness. But Cole did not smile, nor pity. He only met her eyes, gray and unwavering, and said, voice rough yet sure, "Here, no one will cast you off." The words were plain, almost careless, but to Eliza they pierced like an arrow through the thickest ice. Tears sprang, warm against her cheeks. She turned away, ashamed to let him see, but her shoulders quivered, betraying her. Cole said nothing more. He let her weep as though her tears were the washing away of years of fear. His hand rested over hers, not gripping tight, not withdrawing, simply there, steady and enduring. In that moment, both felt something shift. Eliza, for the first time in years, believed she might be worthy of staying, of having a home to return to. And Cole, silent as always, knew that a light had kindled in the hollow of his chest. A light he thought long dead. Outside, the sky cleared. Morning sun broke across puddles, scattering light like shards of glass. Inside the cabin, the fever had passed, and with it, a new bond was born, fragile, but strong enough to hold. That day, the sky hung heavy, clouds thickening with the promise of a hard winter ahead. Cole decided they needed to go into town for salt, flour, and supplies to last the cold months. Eliza hesitated, then nodded. She knew she could not hide forever in the old house, nor survive winter on potatoes and corn alone. The rickety wagon jolted along the dirt road. Wind whipped at Eliza's dress. But it wasn't only the chill that made her tremble. The thought of facing the town again unsettled her more. Since leaving in shame, she had not once returned. Now to appear beside Cole, a solitary man, would only feed the gossip. Her fears proved true. The moment they stepped into the square, eyes turned. Shopkeepers paused, housewives leaned close, young men lounged at the saloon rail and smirked. Eliza dropped her gaze, fingers tightening on her scarf. From the stalls, whispers rose sharp and cutting. "That's the school teacher, dismissed for trying to seduce a pupil's father. And now she's living with a man, not even married." Each word sliced like a blade. Every step weighed heavy, as though she stood bare before the crowd with nothing to shield her. But Cole, tall and steady at her side, moved like a wall against the wind. He neither barked nor argued. He simply reached down, covering her trembling hand with his own. His palm was rough, calloused, yet the grip was firm, carrying a strange warmth. He leaned close, voice low enough for her alone. "It's all right. I'm here." Eliza looked up, her eyes wet. Those few words wrapped her like a thick blanket against the cold sting of scorn. She drew a long breath and walked on. With Cole beside her, the shame did not crush her flat. Still, the town was merciless. By the time Cole carried his plow blade to the blacksmith, men muttered that she was filth, unworthy of a decent home. At the fabric shop, Eliza heard the hiss of voices behind her back, calling her shameless for showing her face. She tried to act deaf, but every word pressed into her chest like lead. On the wagon ride home, she sat silent, eyes dulled, lips pressed thin. Her hands shook against her lap. Cole glanced sideways, saw the tremor, and flicked the reins harder, pushing the horse faster, wanting to outrun the voices that clung like shadows. That evening, Eliza hardly spoke. She busied herself putting away what they'd bought, moved through supper like a ghost, ate only a few bites, then cleared the dishes without meeting his eyes. Cole watched, an ache rising in him. He could weather storms, barren land, and endless miles alone, but he could not shield her from the cruelty of gossip. That truth left him restless. Night fell. The fire burned low, its glow wavering on the walls. Eliza sat curled near the hearth, back hunched, eyes red though no tears fell. Her chin rested on her knees, hair falling forward to cover half her face. The sight of her like that pressed hard on Cole's chest. He moved a chair, closer, slow and quiet. He did not speak. Instead, he reached for the kettle, poured steaming tea into a cup, and set it gently into her trembling hands. Steam curled upward, softening the chill between them. At first, she did not move. Then her fingers closed around the cup, clutching it as though it were the one thing keeping her from slipping. After a moment, she turned, her tear-stained eyes meeting his steady gray ones. No pity, no judgment. Only a presence, enduring, unshakable. In that moment, Eliza's body shook, and her other hand sought his. She did not speak, only gripped lightly, as if pleading not to be left alone. Cole tightened his hold, not crushing, not yielding, just enough to tell her he would not let go. That night, the wind rose in long, mournful cries, as if 100 lost souls wandered the open fields. The old house shuddered under the force, boards groaning, rafters quivering. In the small room, the hearth fire leapt and fell, casting two figures in shadow across the wall, one broad and silent, the other slight, trembling more from what stirred inside than from the cold without. Cole sat back in his chair, eyes fixed on the flames licking at the logs. Outwardly he seemed steady, but his thoughts were a storm. Eliza's presence had unsettled the dust that long covered his heart, and he could not ignore it. He knew well that the closeness between them had gone beyond the ordinary, and he knew just as surely that he could not look away from those clear blue eyes that flickered toward him, only to dart aside whenever he caught them. Across from him, Eliza sat with her hands clasped tight on her lap. Firelight brushed her pale face, lighting eyes that held a tempest. She lifted her gaze, and in that instant all her defenses, all her borrowed pride, broke apart. Her voice was barely more than breath, as if spoken only to the fire. "Please, don't leave me behind." The words slipped out, trembling but resolute. A final confession she had never meant to speak aloud. Even she startled at her own voice. She bit her lip, ashamed at bearing the deepest fear she carried. But before she could turn away, Cole leaned forward. His mouth met hers, tentative at first. He had lived half a life in silence, unsure if he had the right to lay such a claim. But the moment he felt her shuddering breath, all hesitation fell away. The kiss deepened, fierce and long denied, bursting like a dam that had held too much for too many years. Eliza trembled, then yielded, her hands clutching his shoulders. The loneliness, the shame, the cruel words of the town, all of it dissolved in that moment. She was no longer the dismissed teacher, no longer the woman branded with scandal. She was simply a woman, desired, held, chosen. Cole's arms locked around her, drawing her close as though letting go would cast them adrift again. For the first time in years, warmth came not from the hearth or the house, but from the living being in his embrace. They had not come to each other to fill a void. Neither sought to use the other as a balm. They reached for one another to prove they were alive still, that their hearts could still burn, that they were still worthy of love. Eliza gave a small sob within the kiss, not of pain, but of release. Hot tears spilled down her cheeks, streaking onto his skin. Cole paused only to brush them away, his hand rough against her damp face. His voice was raw, whispered between ragged breaths. "Here, you will never be left behind again." Eliza gave no answer, only pressed her face into the solid wall of his chest, listening to the strong, steady pounding of his heart. The sound was unlike the uncertain years she had spent under the shadow of gossip and scorn. That night, their defenses fell away. Eliza belonged to Cole, and Cole to Eliza, fully, without concealment. The curious eyes of the town, the poisoned whispers, all vanished. What remained were two souls, in the shelter of an old cabin, stripped to their truest selves, seen and loved. Outside the wind raged, storms howled down the slopes, but within warmth swelled as if spring had stolen into winter's grip. The fire flared bright, painting their bodies twined together, a living defiance against the dark. When the storm inside them eased, Eliza lay curled in his arms, breath steadying, her lips still curved with the faintest smile. Cole rested his chin atop her hair, peace rare and profound washing over him. He knew nothing could return to what it had been. A bond had been tied, deep and unbreakable. That night they needed no vows. Silence and the grip of their arms were promise enough, that from here on neither would walk alone through the long days ahead. Market day in Holbrook was always a noisy affair. From early morning, folks crowded the square with sacks of grain, bolts of cloth, and a few head of livestock for trade. The air smelled of straw, sweat, and corn cakes frying on griddles. Cole never cared for crowds, but with winter pressing close, they needed food and supplies. Eliza agreed to come, though unease stirred deep within her. At first, all went as it should. They stopped at the grain stand, Eliza carefully choosing sacks of flour, while Cole haggled with the butcher. Then, cutting through the din, a sharp laugh split the air. The sound froze Eliza where she stood, every muscle locking in place. From the cloth stall stepped a heavy-set man in a velvet coat the color of dried blood. His face glistened with sweat, his eyes narrowed with mockery. She knew him. The man who once cornered her, then ruined her name with lies. "Well now, if it isn't Miss Monroe," he drawled, each word pitched for the crowd. "Look at you, walking beside a drifter. A fine match, I'd say." Eliza felt the ground tilt beneath her. Breath came shallow. Her fingers clenched her shawl so tight her knuckles blanched. The memory crashed back. An empty schoolroom, his foul grip, her desperate slap, and the flood of slander that followed. She shook, wishing to flee, to vanish. But then Cole's rough hand settled firm on her shoulder, heavy as stone. She lifted her gaze. He stood tall, gray eyes locked on the man, unblinking. He spoke no word, hurled no insult, but the steel in his stare was enough to make the hut falter half a step. The air thickened. Townsfolk nearby stilled, watching. They all knew the rumors, and now they watched this reckoning unfold. Cole did not need to raise his voice. His hand on her shoulder, the tightening of his grip, was statement enough. She would not face this alone. The man gave a bark of laughter, thin and forced. Muttering, he turned away, vanishing into the crowd. There was no blow struck, no loud defense, but Cole's silence, sharp and unyielding, drove him off all the same. Eliza's knees nearly buckled. She had never thought she would stand before that man again, never thought anyone might shield her. Tears brimmed, but she forced them back. Then Cole bent close, his voice gravelly yet warm in her ear. "No one will touch you again." Her eyes met his, blue and wet, steady against his gray. The trembling inside her eased. She knew the past could not be erased, but the present was no longer the same. Now she had someone who did not need to shout or threaten. Only a hand, only a look, enough to stand guard. They left the market in silence. The road home stretched long, winter wind cutting through their coats. On the wagon seat, Eliza sat close, her hand caught in Cole's, his grip never loosening, not once. She understood then. This day was not only a confrontation with a man, but with the fear that had lived inside her. That night by the hearth, Eliza sat quiet, firelight flickering in eyes still shadowed by memory. Cole joined her without questions, without pressing her to speak. He poured a cup of hot tea and set it in her hands. She clutched it, trembling, until the warmth seeped into her palms. At last she leaned her head against his shoulder. This time she did not feel like a cast-off thing, but like a woman protected. And in that silence, Eliza knew her life had turned to a new chapter. By late afternoon, the sky had darkened, heavy clouds rolling down from the mountains. The air pressed low, carrying the weight of a storm about to break. Cole was no stranger to such weather. But for Eliza, this would be her first night facing the mountain winds in his house. When darkness fell, the gale struck hard. It tore across the porch, rattled the frail door against its frame, and hurled rain against the windows in a furious rhythm. In the kitchen, Eliza stood rigid by the table, her fingers clutching its edge until her knuckles turned white. Her face was tight, her eyes wide, fixed on the trembling window pane. Her shivering came not only from the cold. Memories rose with the storm, nights when she had been cast aside, treated as a burden, unwanted. The wind's howl was like the voices of those who had scorned her, the rain a drumbeat of the false accusations that had scarred her life. Cole stepped in from the outer room and saw her posture drawn taut. He did not ask, nor press her with words. He simply crossed to her, wrapping his arms around her from behind. His embrace was rough with work, but strong and certain, warmth spreading through her narrow frame. At first she stiffened, trapped by the touch. But the deep, steady rhythm of his breathing by her ear began to loosen her fear. She leaned back into him, as a small leaf might cling to a branch against the storm. The wind shrieked, the rain pounded, yet inside the cabin their hearts beat together. Cole rested his chin atop her damp hair. He said nothing, only tightened his hold, as though his weight alone might shield her from the fury outside. At length, Eliza's breath eased. Her voice broke as she whispered, "I hate nights like this. It feels as if everything will be swept away, nothing left to cling to." Cole bent his head, his voice low and gravelly beneath the roar. "But you still have me." The words were simple, yet struck like an anchor. Her fear loosened, her hands sliding free of the table's edge, resting within his grasp. They stood that way for a long while. Outside, the storm raged, battering roof and glass. Inside, the fire crackled, its glow washing the two figures locked together in its warmth. Later, Cole guided her gently into a chair. He fed more wood to the hearth, brought her a dry blanket, and poured steaming tea. Placing the cup in her trembling hands, his eyes spoke what his voice did not. "You do not have to endure alone." Eliza cradled the cup, its heat seeping through her fingers, spreading into her chest until even the inner chill began to fade. She looked up and found his eyes steady upon her, not only protective, but carrying a quiet trust. In that moment she could breathe again. She was no longer the outcast of Holbrook, no longer the woman slandered and cast aside. She was simply herself, sitting in a house where arms strong enough to shield her had claimed her place. The night storm roared on, but inside, peace grew with each quiet act when Eliza let her head rest on Cole's shoulder, her eyelids heavy. She heard his heartbeat firm against his chest. It reminded her that no matter how wild the gale, there would always be a place to return, a soul to trust. And for Cole, feeling her slight weight settle against him, he knew one truth with certainty. His years of lonely nights had ended. Never again would he face the howl of the wind alone. For beside him now was another heart, keeping time with his own. After the stormy night, the morning broke strangely clear. Drops clung to the eaves, catching sunlight and scattering it into 1,000 tiny mirrors. The air smelled fresh, laced with damp soil, as though the land itself promised a new beginning. Cole rose early, as he always did. He stood on the porch, surveying the ground around the house with steady eyes. For years, this place had been nothing more than the ruin of his past. But now it was different. Since the night Eliza had pressed into his arms against the storm, he knew he could not go on hiding. He had to act, not only to protect her, but to show the town that this house was more than decay. It was a home. That same morning, he began the work. The fence posts sagged, rails broken and scattered. Cole tore away the rotted wood, set new beams in place, and drove each nail with the force of conviction. The ringing of his hammer replaced the long silence that had haunted the yard. Sweat soaked his back, but he swung with strength born of purpose. Each strike not only raising a fence, but raising a life for them both. At first Eliza only watched, but soon she found her own tasks. She threw open the dust-fogged windows, letting in light and clean air to sweep away the stale smell. She washed clothes and hung them in the sun, bright cloth fluttering like banners declaring that life had returned. The days followed in rhythm. Cole scraped the weathered paint from the doors, brushing on new strokes until the wood gleamed. He dug the porch soil and planted wildflowers Eliza had gathered from the prairie. They were small, fragile things, but they lifted bright against the hard ground, just like her. Eliza, too, stepped further into the light. She began inviting neighbor children to learn their letters at the kitchen table. They sat wide-eyed as she traced alphabets on a worn board, her voice calm and patient. To hear her again as teacher was to hear a note of peace rising above the old gossip. Some in town still lingered at the fence, whispering, sometimes smirking. But Eliza no longer lowered her eyes. She held her posture straight, continued teaching. Outside, Cole kept at his work, hammer steady, back unbent. He needed no quarrel, no defense. Their quiet labor was answer enough. One afternoon, as Eliza pinned a blanket to dry, a neighbor woman passed, pausing just long enough to nod. Nothing was said, but the small gesture softened Eliza's chest. Not everyone had turned away. Bit by bit, their acts were planting change. Inside, the hearth now blazed every evening. At the table came the laughter of children dropping by in thanks, the sound of spoons against bowls, the unspoken warmth in a glance exchanged across the firelight. Eliza's hands stayed busy, yet her heart felt light. For Cole, each fence post set, each door restored, laid another stone of certainty. Once he had believed himself only a wanderer, a man without harbor. Yet with every stroke of his hammer, he was building more than shelter. He was building a home, for her as much as for himself. Late one night, when the work was done, Cole sat on the porch steps. Moonlight spread across the yard, painting the house in silver. Eliza joined him, hands still carrying the faint scent of soap. She lowered herself beside him, quiet. They both looked upon the house, not as a relic, but as something alive again. Eliza smiled softly, her voice almost a whisper. "It looks like a real home now." Cole turned to her, his voice rough but steady. "Because it's ours." The words held her still. All the shame, the fear that had followed her, seemed to scatter into the night. She had found where she belonged. The town might yet whisper, but within these walls, each nail, each stitch, each shared step was weaving something greater, a home, unshakable and lasting. That morning, dawn broke earlier than usual. The sky stretched clear, not a single cloud, golden light spilling across the wide prairie. Puddles left by the storm glittered like shards of glass, reflecting the promise of a day washed clean. Inside the cabin, the air was different. Sunlight poured through the freshly painted window frame, falling across the coarse brown blanket and the white pillows Eliza had scrubbed sweet the day before. The room no longer bore the gloom of neglect, but glowed in warm, honeyed light. Eliza shifted, her face nestled against Cole's shoulder. Her breathing was steady, free of the tension that once haunted her nights. No nightmares jolted her awake. No storm winds echoed in her sleep. Her rest was deep, untroubled, as though at last her heart had found a refuge. Cole opened his eyes, feeling her warmth pressed close. He turned his head, catching the tumble of brown hair against his chest, strands glinting with the first rays of sun. Her face in sleep looked younger, fragile yet peaceful. The sight stilled him, rare contentment slipping into his heart. He scarcely dared move, afraid to break the moment. Slowly, he lifted a hand and brushed a stray lock from her cheek. Her skin was soft beneath his rough touch, warmth rising into his palm. His voice, husky, slipped out low, meant only for her ears if she stirred. "From now on, nothing will take us apart." Eliza stirred, lashes fluttering as if her spirit had caught his whisper. She opened her eyes, meeting his gaze. In the gray that so often seemed cold, she saw only gentleness. She smiled, faint but brighter than the morning light itself. They spoke no more. They lay still, breaths mingling, letting the dawn itself stand witness to a new beginning. Outside, the town still bristled with judgment. Gossip had not gone quiet. Yet when Eliza stepped onto the porch to hang a towel in the sun, she no longer shrank beneath unseen eyes. For beside her was Cole, who needed no words, for every look and every clasp of his hand carried a promise steady as stone. Cole, as he drove nails into a fence post, looked over at her. He saw her standing tall, her face lifted toward the horizon. Morning light crowned her features, no trace of the shrinking fear that had once shadowed her. A swell of quiet pride filled his chest. That day, they worked side by side, Eliza sweeping the porch, Cole splitting logs and stacking them neat. Simple, ordinary tasks, yet each one said the same truth. This was their home. By mid-morning, neighbor children scampered over, old notebooks in hand, begging Eliza for lessons. She sat on the steps, chalking letters onto a worn slate, while the little ones circled close, eyes bright. Cole leaned in the doorway, arms crossed, watching. To him, the sight was worth more than anything the wandering years had ever offered. He knew the road ahead would not be without trouble. But with each bright morning, with each of Eliza's smiles, he felt surer than ever that they had chosen rightly. That evening, as the sun sank behind the mountains, Eliza stood in the kitchen. The scent of cornbread drifted through the house. Cole came in, wiping sweat from his brow, and the scene filled him with a plain, fierce satisfaction. He needed no feast, no praise from the world. A woman at the stove, a lamp lit within four walls. These were riches enough. When they sat at the table, candlelight played across their faces. Cole reached for her hand. No words were spoken. The firm press of his palm was enough. She knew what it meant. He would not leave, no matter what voices rose beyond their door. The new dawn was not only the light through the window that morning. It was the start of another life, where Eliza no longer trembled, where Cole no longer drifted, and where together they built the true shelter of a home. The years passed, and the cabin that had once stood gray and hollow now bore the shape of a true home. Wildflowers Cole had planted climbed across the porch, their purple blooms trembling in the wind. Inside, the scent of new timber mingled with the smell of cornbread Eliza baked each morning. No more shadows lurking in corners, no more wind hissing through broken seams. Every space breathed with life. Children's laughter rang like a hymn through the valley. Eliza sat on the porch steps, the old wooden slate propped before her, two little ones repeating letters in her clear, patient voice. Their giggles followed each attempt, the sound carrying across the yard. Her hair had grown longer, her eyes brighter. Peace now softened her face, a peace Cole once thought she might never know. From the corral, Cole paused in tightening a cinch strap, his gaze drawn to the scene at the porch. His lips tugged into a rare smile. All his wandering years had not given him a single moment like this, time standing still as he watched the woman and children who had become the very thing he'd unknowingly searched for. The townsfolk, once quick to whisper and mock, had begun to fall silent. At first they lingered on the edges, eyes wary. But as seasons passed, as they saw the garden bloom, the children thrive, and Eliza's smile shine, their talk dwindled. Some truths needed no defense. Happiness itself was proof enough. Cole sometimes spoke, in his low, steady way, that his life had circled wide only to return to the beginning. A small home, a courageous woman, and the blessing of children. One night beneath a silver moon, with the barley fields rippling like water, he told Eliza, "All those years of drifting, only to learn what I needed most was here." She gave no reply, only pressed his hand, for she needed no pretty vows. Each day with him was proof beyond words. One summer evening, as the sky flared red with sunset, Eliza stepped onto the porch, cradling their youngest. The child cooed, blue eyes like her mother's, tiny hand stretching to grasp the air. Cole was already there, silent and steady, the scent of sweat and earth clinging to him. She leaned into his shoulder, her burdens easing in that simple act. Cole wrapped his arm around them both. From inside the cabin, the older children spilled out, bare feet slapping the grass, chasing each other in circles, their laughter bright as bells. That music wove with the prairie wind, a song Cole knew would live in him forever. He looked toward the horizon, fields awash in gold beneath the setting sun. Light touched Eliza's hair, the children's faces, even the worn lines of his own. In that moment he felt all storms had faded behind him. No more restless miles, no more lonely nights. Before him was a home alive with breath and love, and in it, a man finally at rest. The town adjusted. No longer did they spit her name with venom. They called her plain and simple now. Mrs. Harrington neighbor children still came to learn letters, and their parents no longer protested. Some neighbors even offered seed. Others stopped to drink tea with Eliza on her porch. Time had done what arguments could not, proved that love, when steady enough, could melt prejudice. On quiet nights, when the house lay still, Cole often sat on the porch listening to the wind. He remembered his years as a drifter, quick meals in roadside inns, nights alone in empty rooms. Then he would return inside, see Eliza curled with their youngest asleep in her arms, and know every weary mile had led him here. One evening as the sun dipped, Eliza stepped out again with the baby in her arms. Cole stood waiting, silent as ever. She leaned against him, and his arm came around them all. Before them, the prairie glowed gold, children's laughter echoing into the wide sky. Cole drew a long breath, as though to etch it into his bones. The warmth at his side, the joy of young voices, the fading light of day. He knew then the storms of life were done. Ahead lay only peace, a home, a woman's hand, and children's laughter, the truest music of his life. Perhaps all of us walk through seasons of loneliness, believing we have no place to return. But like Cole and Eliza's story, love often blooms in the smallest acts. A cup of hot tea in a cold night, a hand held steady in a crowded square, a porch light burning for the one who comes home. Years later, children's laughter filled every room of the cabin, while the past retreated like storms across the plains. Love, patient and honest, had healed the deepest wounds. A home is not always where one is born. Sometimes it is where someone truly sees you and never lets go. If this story touched your heart, share in the comments. Where do love and peace find you in life? And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, so more friends may hear Wild West love stories like this one. Our thanks go especially to our older listeners, who know best the worth of loyalty and a simple, steady home.